The Holy Gospel according to Luke. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by, watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who was hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." The gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. Well, this is quite a fitting place to end our liturgical year. Next week, we begin with Advent, which marks the beginning of the liturgical calendar. But here we end with the description of what Christ has done for us, what he means to us, and who he really was. So, story is, he's on his way to his crucifixion. At this moment, as he's on the way, he's got Simon the Cyrenian carrying the cross for him. Women had told him that they were weeping for him and they were worried for him. And he said, "Don't worry about me. Worry about yourselves for the coming destruction." Because he knew that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed by the Romans. And he was giving them the same advice that Jeremiah had given the people of Jerusalem when the Babylonians were on the way to destroy the city. Nevertheless, they're on the way to the skull called Golgotha. Jesus was going to be crucified there. Now, you've heard some people say probably that it was called the place of the skull because there was a rock formation that looked like a skull. That's not it. We've been told that a long time, but that's not why it was called that. There was a belief, and remember, I'll always tell you what the people of the first century heard, what they were understanding when they heard the words of Jesus or read the writings of the Gospels. The place was called the Skull because it was believed among the people of Judea that Adam had been buried there. Now, do we know that to be true? No, but this was a custom. This was a tradition that they believed. They believed that the skull and the bones of Adam were buried there on that hill. And Jesus is going to be crucified on the same place. As Paul would put it, the second man, the last Adam, was going to be buried where the first Adam was buried. You'll see in a lot of religious art that where you see the crucifixion of Jesus, a lot of times you'll see a skull down below the cross, almost below the ground. Sometimes even bones are there. That's their idea, is that this is where Adam was buried. So what a fitting place for the one who undoes the guilt of Adam should be buried right above Adam's grave place. That was the tradition. So now they're on the way. They're going to be crucified. There's three of them, two criminals, one on the left, one on the right. A lot of times we heard them described as thieves. They weren't thieves, not in the sense of stealing a loaf of bread or anything like that. They were actually more like bandits in the sense of these guys were revolutionaries. And how fitting and ironic that Jesus, the true revolutionary, should be crucified between the two would-be revolutionaries, those who were looking for political revolution and freedom by means of insurrection, when the true liberator crucified between them. So he's being crucified, and he says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. This is actually a reference back to Isaiah, when Isaiah talks about the one who had been endowed with favor from God, and that he would even forgive his transgressors. Jesus is fulfilling that. In fact, so many of these sayings that we will see here are references to Jeremiah and Isaiah and the Psalms, even Hosea. And it's Jesus taking his place as the great prophet, more than prophet, the liberator, the Messiah, in Greek, the Christ. So he's using all these phrases from the Old Testament. He's nowhere telling us that the Old Testament is now invalid. By no means. Jesus is saying that everything the prophet said set the stage for what he was doing. Jesus is putting himself in this long line of prophets. Even here at the very last, he will say things that are straight out of the texts of the prophets. So, as Isaiah says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Then it says that they cast lots for his clothing. And it says that the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, He saved others. Let him save himself if he's the Messiah of God, his chosen one. And that is lifted entirely out of Psalm 22. Everybody knows the 23rd Psalm, but the 22nd Psalm is the one that most closely resembles the experience of Christ. In fact, the psalmist said that he's being surrounded by dogs. He is being surrounded by those who want to kill him. They mock at him. And it says they divide my clothing. They cast lots, throw dice to divide my clothing. I think about that sometimes and how absolutely horrifying. No matter what we go through, we almost always have this hope that there is a deliverance waiting for us. We'll get out of this somehow. But could you imagine being nailed and tied to a cross, and you see them making preparation for when you're gone? They start to take your clothes. Horrifying. But then in that same passage, it says the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him. And they said, let him save himself. Those three words, the watching, the scoffing, and the save himself, also all three of those words in the Aramaic comes from the Psalms. When it says again in Psalm 22 that the people, that they're watching me and they're making fun of me, ridiculing me, scoffing at me, and I'm supposed to save myself. It says that the soldiers also mocked him, and they came up and they offered him sour wine. That sour wine, a lot of times we think it to be, oh, the soldiers are being compassionate and trying to offer him some wine. Well, this sour wine, it's really not much more than vinegar. This sour wine wasn't meant to refresh him. This is the same drink that the soldiers drink. This is a commoner's drink. And so here he is with the inscription above his head, the King of the Jews, and the Romans are saying, this is no king. He's not getting the fine wine. This is a commoner who gets the sour wine. Even more sinister is the idea that the Romans are giving him this wine in order to prolong his suffering. The wine would give him some energy to endure. The wine would give him a little bit more lasting power. And so they're increasing his suffering by giving him this wine. Monstrous. Well, if you are the King of the Jews, they say, save yourself. And then there's the inscription. Because they love the idea that they've got this inscription over this man that they're crucifying. This is the King of the Jews. And if you remember the scene from when Pilate orders that inscription to be put on there, the religious leaders came and said, don't put that on there. Say rather, he said he was the King of the Jews. And Pilate answers, I have written what I have written, meaning that Pilate has control over the Jews. Pilate has control even over the one who calls himself the King of the Jews. So this is one more derision, one more humiliation. You're the King of the Jews? Well, we'll serve you this vinegary wine. We can put you to death. Even the King of the Jews can be executed by the power of Rome. So one of the criminals, then, one of these revolutionaries, says to Jesus, aren't you the Messiah? Then save yourself and us. Thinking of himself, what does he want? He's wanting to be delivered from that. But even he, in his terminal condition, is making fun of Christ. But then there's this other guy, the one on the other side, who says, what are you doing? Don't you fear God? You are under the very same condemnation, both of us, as he is. We are going to die on this cross. And we have it coming. We deserve this. We are being put to death because of what we have done. We are guilty. But not this guy. This man has done nothing wrong. And there it is. Jesus, who did nothing wrong, was considered a blasphemer by the Jewish leadership. He was considered a revolutionary by the Romans, because remember, crucifixion is a penalty reserved for revolutionaries. So even the Romans are considering Jesus to be something dangerous. But he's done nothing wrong, this man says. And then in a moment of great realization, he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He knows that the kingdom of Jesus is a spiritual kingdom. Is he believing in an afterlife? We don't quite know. But he's just saying, just remember me. Whatever happens, wherever you wind up, remember me. And then Jesus says, okay, truly I tell you, Today you will be with me in paradise. And that's the ball game. No matter what happens after that, Jesus here says, whoever I say is going to be in paradise will be in paradise. There was a great work written in the early church. It was called the Acts of Nicodemus, or in some places, the Gospel of Nicodemus. And in that story, Nicodemus encounters those who had been resurrected at the same time Jesus had. If you remember reading in the Gospel according to John, it tells us that when Jesus resurrected, that in the city of Jerusalem, people saw others who had died recently walking around. Well, Nicodemus and Gamaliel and some others who were among the Pharisees and even among the Sanhedrin court, they went to the two sons of Caiaphas who had died. And they said, "What did you see?" And the sons of Caiaphas said, "Give us paper, give us writing instruments, and we will write down separately what we saw, because we haven't conferred, and we were ordered by the Holy Spirit to keep quiet until someone should come and ask us about this." And in the story that they tell, and it's a very long story, and it really does deserve a fair reading, but in the story, they are in captivity. It's not really to be confused with paradise. It was simply the place where they slept. It was referred to as Sheol, which was where the dead resided, until such a time as they could be judged and taken into heaven. Well, they tell the story that they're in captivity there, and there is all the patriarchs. There's Adam, there's Noah, there's Moses, there's Abraham. Everyone was there. David was there. And then there's a storming of the gates, and Jesus comes in and he liberates everyone who is there. Doesn't just say the righteous who are there. It says that he liberates everybody and says, "Here we go. We're leaving this place and we're heading to paradise." And on the way out, as they're on their way to paradise, Jesus encounters the two bandits, the ones who are at the cross, and says, "I promised you, come along with me." A guy, I forgot his name, and I'm sorry because I'd like to credit him. A guy gave a sermon a few years ago, and he talked about when the bandit, when the revolutionary, the one who hung beside Jesus, when he had gone to the gates of paradise, he was told, "You're not allowed in. You haven't led a righteous life. You haven't been a believer. You haven't followed the things you're supposed to follow." And the man said, the revolutionary said, "Yeah, but the guy on the middle cross said I could come." What a beautiful thought. What an amazing thought. That even though we've lived our lives as sinners, I have, you have, we all have, the man on the middle cross said we could join him in paradise. What a wonderful end to our liturgical year, that through everything that we've studied about Jesus' ministry, through everything that he's been through the struggles that he had, the struggles that we have, the man on the middle cross tells us it's okay. Doesn't matter what you've done before. You're welcome in paradise. And thank God for that. We can't do it on our own. But the man in the middle says we're welcome. And thanks be to God.